You're going to want to rethink who you just asked to leave this room. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried a calm certainty that made the entire strategy room pause for half a second longer than comfort allowed. Inside a glass-walled boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago, a high-level leadership meeting for Orion Global Technologies was already in motion, charts glowing on the screen, quarterly projections stacked in clean columns, voices overlapping with the confidence of people who believed they controlled the outcome. At the far end of the table sat Evelyn Carter, dressed simply, no visible branding, no attempt to dominate the space, just presence, quiet, deliberate, observant. Most people in the room assumed she was part of a consulting audit team or an external advisor observing final stage discussions. No one had asked directly, and she had offered no clarification. That silence, however, was about to be misread in a way none of them would recover from. Richard Hale, the chief operating officer, leaned forward with the practiced ease of someone used to closing rooms with his voice alone. He tapped a pen against the table once, twice, then set it down as if marking the end of patience. "We need to keep this session limited to executive decision-makers," he said, his eyes drifting toward Evelyn without fully acknowledging her. A subtle pause followed, the kind that invites others to agree without questioning. Around the table, a few heads nodded. Someone shifted a laptop closed. The atmosphere tightened, not with hostility yet, but with the quiet formation of exclusion. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the projected financial model on the screen, as if confirming something only she could see. That small act of attention, rather than reaction, unsettled Richard more than resistance would have. A younger analyst near the middle of the table, Daniel Brooks, hesitated. His cursor flickered over an internal system dashboard, and for a brief moment his expression changed. He leaned slightly forward, scanning something that didn't match what the others were saying. "Actually," Daniel began cautiously, "her access level is listed as stay in your lane." Richard cut in without looking at him. The words landed cleanly, shutting down not just the comment, but the thought behind it. The room returned to its controlled rhythm, but something had already shifted. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone measured, neither defensive nor confrontational. "Before you decide who belongs in this room," she said, "you may want to confirm who authorized the room itself." A faint, almost polite smile appeared on Richard's face, the kind people use when they believe they are entertaining a misunderstanding. "This meeting is structured for senior leadership only," he replied, gesturing lightly toward the door, as if indicating an exit that didn't require urgency. The implication was clear enough that it didn't need to be stated directly. A few uncomfortable exhales followed, subtle alignment forming around authority, around habit, around assumption. Evelyn's gaze didn't break. She looked at each face briefly, as if registering something beyond their words, then reached calmly for her tablet. "Then let's proceed accordingly," she said quietly. And in that moment, without raising her voice or changing her posture, she pressed a single command that none of them could see. The room did not change at first, but something beneath its surface did, like a subtle shift in pressure that no one could immediately name. Richard Hale continued speaking as if nothing had happened, yet his cadence slowed by a fraction, as though the air itself had become slightly heavier to navigate. On the main display, the financial model remained visible, but a small notification flickered in the corner of the internal system interface that only a few people had access to. Daniel Brooks noticed it again, this time more clearly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he was hearing. He leaned toward his screen, quietly pulling up the governance access panel through a secondary terminal, his expression tightening when he saw a new status line appear that did not match standard protocol. Across the table, Evelyn Carter remained still, her attention now resting on the room rather than the data, as if she had already seen the outcome of whatever was about to unfold. Richard finally turned fully toward her, his patience thinning into irritation. "If there is a concern regarding your presence here, it should have been addressed before this meeting began," he said, his tone firm enough to signal finality. A few executives exchanged glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or a disruption that required correction. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Instead, she placed her tablet down gently, the sound barely audible, yet it cut through the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. "There is no concern about my presence," she said evenly. "There is only a gap in understanding about authority." That word lingered longer than expected, drawing brief silence from the table. Daniel shifted again, this time speaking with more hesitation. "Sir, her credentials are listed under executive override permissions," he said, looking toward Richard as if seeking permission to continue speaking. Richard's gaze snapped toward him. "Permissions can be misfiled or incorrectly assigned," he replied sharply. "We are not stopping a leadership meeting because of a system entry error." But even as he spoke, a second notification appeared on the central system display, followed by another, each one quietly updating access status across different departments. Evelyn finally stood, not abruptly, but with a calm precision that redirected attention without demand. "You invited me into a conversation about restructuring leadership accountability," she said. "What you did not confirm is who holds the structure itself." At that exact moment, Daniel's screen refreshed again, and this time the label beside Evelyn Carter's name changed from observer classification to governance authority. A faint breath escaped someone near the end of the table, though no one admitted to it. Richard noticed the shift in Daniel's expression and followed his gaze. For the first time, uncertainty replaced certainty in his posture. Evelyn's voice remained steady, neither elevated nor softened. "Before we proceed further," she continued, "you may want to review the current authorization update that was just executed." The room fell into a controlled stillness as multiple devices across the table synchronized with the same internal alert, each confirming a change that none of them had anticipated and none of them could ignore. The silence that followed was no longer ordinary silence. It had weight, like the kind of stillness that appears right before a structural collapse that everyone can sense, but no one knows how to stop. Around the table, executives who had been confident only minutes earlier now sat slightly straighter, their attention fixed on the central display where multiple system alerts continued to refresh in synchronized intervals. Daniel Brooks did not speak this time. His hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitant, as if any additional input might confirm what he was already beginning to understand. Richard Hale, however, forced a short laugh, the kind people use when they are trying to reclaim control of a narrative that is slipping. "System updates happen during live sessions, all the time," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "This does not change the structure of this meeting." Evelyn Carter remained standing, her posture unchanged, her attention steady on the room rather than the screen. When she finally spoke, her tone carried no urgency, only clarity. "You are correct that systems update regularly," she said. "What is different is not the update itself, but what it reflects about authority alignment." A few executives exchanged quick glances, the kind that revealed doubt before it becomes spoken. One of them reached for their tablet and refreshed the governance dashboard manually, then paused when the interface returned a confirmation banner indicating executive restructuring protocols had been activated at a corporate level. Daniel's expression shifted fully now, the realization forming too clearly to ignore. He turned slightly toward Richard, lowering his voice. "Sir, her profile is not listed as a participant role," he said carefully. "It is listed as governance authority with override capability." Richard's jaw tightened, but he did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his own device, attempting to access higher-level permissions, only to find a temporary restriction notice that had not been there earlier. The room's atmosphere changed again, this time more visibly. Chairs that had been leaned back were now forward-facing. Conversations that had been quiet were now completely absent. Evelyn finally took a step closer to the table, not to dominate it, but to align herself with it, as if re-establishing the context of the conversation. This meeting was initiated to evaluate leadership efficiency and structural alignment within Orion Global Technologies, she said calmly. That evaluation is now active. Richard's voice lowered, carefully controlled but no longer dismissive. "If this is about governance review," he said, "it should have been communicated through formal executive channels." Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. "It was," she replied. "The communication was sent at the beginning of this session and acknowledged through the same system you are currently logged into." That statement shifted the room again, because several executives now remembered a standard notification earlier in the meeting that they had dismissed as procedural background noise. Daniel looked down at his screen once more, this time scrolling back through the session log. What he found confirmed what he had feared, that authorization had been granted before the meeting began, not during it. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. The session was pre-approved under full governance review status, he said. No one challenged him this time. Evelyn's gaze moved across the table slowly, not with judgment, but with assessment. The question you are all now facing, she said, is not whether I belong in this room. It is whether the decisions made in this room align with the authority that governs it. The display behind her refreshed once more, and this time the heading at the top of the governance panel changed to confirm active executive realignment protocol, marking the moment where assumption ended and structure began to shift. The confirmation on the central display did not fade. Instead, it deepened as if the system itself was settling into a new configuration that no longer required validation from the people in the room. A subtle notification banner expanded across every connected device on the boardroom table, repeating the same line of text with clinical precision. Executive Governance Realignment Protocol active. No one spoke immediately after that. The absence of speech was no longer confusion, it was recognition. Richard Hale finally lowered his hand from his device, realizing that repeated attempts to access administrative controls were returning the same restricted status. His posture shifted slightly, not in defiance now, but in recalibration. Around him, other executives began to quietly verify their own dashboards, each discovering the same structural change reflected across the system. Daniel Brooks remained still for several seconds before he spoke, his voice careful and uncertain. All voting permissions for this session have been temporarily suspended, he said, reading directly from the interface. Authority has been reassigned under centralized governance oversight. That sentence changed the atmosphere more than any previous update. It removed ambiguity. Evelyn Carter remained composed, her attention steady across the room, as if she had already accounted for every reaction now unfolding. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. This is not a disruption, she said calmly. This is alignment correction. Richard finally turned toward her fully, his expression controlled but strained, as if he were trying to find an angle that still allowed him to regain footing. You are effectively overriding a live executive session, he said. Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging the statement without granting it resistance. What you are calling override, she replied, is the restoration of intended authority structure. A faint tension moved through the room as several executives looked down again at their screens, noticing a secondary layer of documentation now visible beneath the governance update. It detailed approval history, timestamps, and authorization pathways that traced back before the meeting had even begun. Daniel leaned forward, slightly, scanning line after line, his expression shifting from confusion to reluctant clarity. This was scheduled as a pre-authorized governance audit, he said quietly. Signed off at board level 2 days ago. That statement landed heavily because it reframed everything that had happened since the beginning of the session. Richard's gaze tightened, but there was no immediate rebuttal. Instead, he looked around the table, as if searching for someone else who might still share his version of control. Evelyn stepped closer to the table now, not as an intruder, but as the point around which the room was recentering itself. You were invited into a review process, she said, not a negotiation of authority. The words were calm, but absolute in structure. One of the senior directors exhaled slowly, breaking the silence with a question that carried more uncertainty than challenge. If this is an audit, he asked, why was it not disclosed as such from the start of the meeting? Evelyn's answer came without delay. Because the purpose of this session was not to prepare you. It was to observe you. That final clarification settled over the room like a quiet closing of a door that no one had noticed opening earlier. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, his presence still occupying the space he had assumed belonged to him, but now visibly disconnected from the system around him. The interface behind Evelyn updated one more time, confirming full governance visibility activation across all leadership layers, marking the point where observation ended and irreversible structure began to take hold. The room had fully shifted into a different state, one that no longer resembled a standard executive meeting, but instead felt like a controlled system review unfolding in real time. The central display continued to refresh at steady intervals, each update reinforcing the same structural message without variation. Authority alignment complete. Governance oversight active. Executive voting rights suspended. Richard Hale stood near the table, no longer speaking, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured stillness that suggested he was now processing outcomes rather than attempting to direct them. Around him, several executives began to quietly close their devices, not out of protest, but out of recognition that their inputs no longer influenced the system state currently in effect. Daniel Brooks remained focused on his terminal, scrolling through deeper layers of documentation that had become visible only after the governance shift. His expression changed gradually as he followed the audit trail downward, revealing structured approvals, layered confirmations, and timestamps that confirmed the process had been established well before the meeting began. He hesitated before speaking, then did so with careful precision. All executive actions in this session are now under review classification, he said. No further independent voting input is being registered. A low murmur passed through the room, not of disbelief, but of acknowledgement that the environment had fundamentally changed. Evelyn Carter remained standing at the center of the room's attention field, her presence steady, her expression unchanged. She did not appear to be reacting to the shift because she had already accounted for it. Instead, she continued in a calm and structured tone. "This is not a termination of discussion," she said. "It is a transition from assumption-based governance to verified authority structure." Richard finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, stripped of earlier certainty. "If this was predetermined," he said, "then what exactly was the purpose of allowing this conversation to proceed?" Evelyn turned her gaze toward him directly. "To observe decision-making under unverified assumptions," she replied. The answer removed any remaining ambiguity in the room. Several executives shifted in their seats, realizing the implications of what had just been stated. This was not an interruption of their authority in reaction to their behavior. It was an evaluation of it. Daniel's screen refreshed again, and this time a new layer of system notes appeared beneath the governance header. It listed behavioral markers, response classifications, and decision patterns recorded throughout the session. He read silently for a moment before speaking. Again, his voice lower now. "This session includes full behavioral audit logging across all participants," he said. "Every decision point has been recorded for governance review." The phrase behavioral audit logging caused a visible reaction across the table. Not panic, not resistance, but the realization of permanence. Richard looked toward the table surface for a moment, then back to Evelyn, as if recalibrating the meaning of everything that had been said since the beginning of the meeting. "So this was never a discussion," he said slowly. Evelyn responded without hesitation. It was a mirror. The words settled into the room and remained there. No one challenged it. The system display behind her updated once more, confirming full session closure pending governance review completion, signaling that what remained was no longer influence or debate, but consequence and evaluation. The stillness in the room had evolved into something more structured than silence. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of consequence forming in real time. Every executive remained seated, not by instruction, but by the unspoken understanding that movement no longer changed outcome. On the central display, a new layer of system protocol unfolded line by line, confirming governance verification and compliance alignment across all active participants. Daniel Brooks read it carefully, his eyes tracking each update as if trying to locate a point where the system might still allow interpretation. There was none. Everything was now explicit, logged, and irreversible in structure. Richard Hale finally stepped back from the table, not in retreat, but in recognition that proximity no longer granted influence. His voice, when he spoke, was measured but noticeably restrained. "If this is a governance action," he said, "then there must be a formal escalation pathway." Evelyn Carter turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her tone calm and precise. "The escalation pathway has already been executed," she replied. That statement shifted the room again, because it implied that what they were witnessing was not initiation, but confirmation. Daniel's screen refreshed once more, and a new designation appeared beneath the active protocol header. It read System Enforcement Phase Engaged. He hesitated before speaking, as if confirming it aloud might make it more permanent than it already was. System Enforcement Phase is now active, he said quietly. A few executives exchanged brief glances, but no one interrupted. The structure of authority in the room had already redistributed itself away from individual perception. Evelyn stepped closer to the table, her presence steady, her voice continuing in the same controlled cadence. This phase is not designed for reaction, she said. It is designed for resolution based on recorded behavioral and structural data. Richard looked at her more carefully now, as if trying to separate assumption from reality. Resolution, he repeated slowly. Evelyn nodded once. Accountability is not decided in the moment it is revealed, she said. It is confirmed when all input has been evaluated without influence. The words landed with a weight that did not require emphasis. Daniel's attention returned to his screen as another update appeared, this time detailing compliance mapping across leadership roles. One by one, executive identifiers were marked with status evaluations, not as punishment, but as classification. He exhaled slowly, realizing that the system was not reacting to emotion, but completing a process that had been running silently beneath their conversation from the beginning. Richard finally lowered himself into his chair again, not because he had regained control, but because standing no longer provided any strategic value. He looked around the room once more, taking in the faces of his leadership team, all of whom were now quietly observing the same realization without needing to speak it. Evelyn's voice remained steady, concluding the active phase of observation with final clarity. What you are witnessing is not removal of authority, she said. It is the confirmation of where authority has always resided. The display behind her shifted one final time, transitioning from active protocol to confirmed governance resolution status, marking the end of uncertainty and the beginning of structural finalization. The confirmation of governance resolution did not fade from the central display. Instead, it stabilized into a persistent state indicator that remained visible across every connected device in the boardroom. The room itself had become quieter than before, not from uncertainty, but from acceptance that the system was no longer in a transitional phase. It had completed its internal evaluation cycle. Daniel Brooks sat back slightly in his chair, his hands no longer moving across the keyboard. His screen still displayed layered audit results, but there was nothing left to interpret in real time. Everything had already been decided through structured logic that preceded human reaction. Richard Hale remained seated as well, his posture no longer rigid, but contained, as if conserving energy for a conversation that would no longer alter direction. He looked toward Evelyn Carter with a measured expression, one that carried recognition rather than resistance. "So this is final," he said quietly. Evelyn did not move from her position at the front of the table. Her voice, when it came, remained calm and precise, carrying the same controlled clarity it had maintained throughout the session. "This has always been final," she replied. The distinction was subtle, but it removed any remaining assumption that negotiation or reinterpretation was still possible. Daniel's attention returned briefly to the system interface as a final confirmation layer appeared. It listed executive roles in structured format, each one now assigned a post-evaluation status under governance authority. No alarms sounded. No warnings flashed. The process was quiet, procedural, and complete. One of the senior directors finally spoke, breaking the silence carefully. "What happens after this session is closed?" he asked. "To the current leadership structure?" Evelyn turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the question without altering her tone. "The structure remains," she said. "What changes is who is authorized to operate within it." That answer settled across the room like a final definition. Richard looked down briefly at the table, then back toward the central display, as if confirming for himself that what he was hearing matched what he was seeing. It did. Daniel exhaled slowly, then closed his laptop, not in frustration, but in recognition that further input was no longer relevant to the outcome. Evelyn stepped forward one final time, not closer to any individual, but to the collective space of the room itself. "This meeting was not designed to create change through discussion," she said. "It was designed to confirm alignment between authority and execution." The words were not delivered with emphasis, yet they carried a finality that required no repetition. Around the table, no one attempted to respond immediately. The system display behind her shifted one last time, transitioning from active governance protocol to closed resolution status, marking the end of operational uncertainty. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then slowly placed his hands on the table, not as a gesture of resistance, but as acknowledgement that the structure he had been operating within had now been fully defined. Evelyn's gaze remained steady across the room as she delivered the final line. From this point forward, she said, decisions will no longer be evaluated by assumption. They will be executed through verified authority. The screen dimmed slightly, leaving only the governance confirmation marker visible, signaling that the session had moved beyond discussion and into permanent structural record. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had fully transitioned from observation to irreversible consequence, not through sudden movement, but through a quiet structural finality that settled into every device, every screen, and every participant in the room. The governance confirmation marker remained steady on the central display, no longer updating because there was nothing left to evaluate in real time. Daniel Brooks sat still, his attention no longer shifting between inputs, as every layer of executive data had already transitioned into finalized status reports. Richard Hale remained in his chair, his hands resting on the table, his expression controlled but no longer resistant, as if the weight of understanding had replaced the need for response. Across the room, other executives began to acknowledge the same reality in subtle ways, closing interfaces, lowering devices, and shifting posture from participation to observation. Evelyn Carter stood at the front of the room with complete composure, her presence unchanged by the shift that had occurred around her. When she spoke, her voice maintained the same measured clarity that had defined every stage of the process. At this point, she said, the governance review has moved into execution confirmation. The phrase did not introduce new information, but rather defined what was already unfolding in structured form. Daniel glanced once more at his screen, where executive identifiers had transitioned into post-resolution classification states. He spoke carefully, as if verifying something that required no correction but demanded acknowledgement. All leadership roles in this session are now marked under conditional continuation review, he said. No one challenged the wording, because no one could find a version of the system that contradicted it. Richard finally spoke again, his tone subdued, not argumentative. What happens to operational continuity after this? He asked. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, maintaining eye contact without hesitation. Operational continuity remains intact, she replied. What changes is authorization to influence its direction. That distinction settled across the room with unmistakable clarity. It separated presence from power, participation from control, and visibility from authority. A few executives exchanged brief glances, not in confusion, but in recognition that the framework they had been operating under had already been redefined before they fully realized it. Daniel closed his laptop completely now, placing his hands flat on the table for a moment before resting them in his lap, signaling that his role in real-time validation had concluded. Evelyn continued, her voice steady and controlled. This review process was not designed to create disruption, she said. It was designed to confirm alignment between declared authority and actual system governance. The central display behind her updated one final time, transitioning from active protocol to finalized governance record status, indicating that all evaluation pathways had been completed and archived. Richard looked toward the screen, then back at Evelyn, as if acknowledging a shift that could no longer be reversed or interpreted differently. The room itself felt unchanged physically, yet structurally it had become something else entirely, defined not by discussion, but by recorded outcome. Evelyn delivered her final statement without emphasis or pause. From this moment forward, she said, all executive action will operate under verified governance structure rather than assumed hierarchy. The confirmation marker stabilized on every interface in the room, marking the completion of the transition from evaluation to permanent structural authority. The boardroom did not return to normal because normal no longer applied to the structure that had just been finalized. The central governance display remained active, now showing a static confirmation state that indicated completion rather than ongoing evaluation. The silence inside the room had changed in quality again, becoming lighter but more absolute, as if the weight of uncertainty had been fully removed and replaced with fixed outcome. Daniel Brooks was the first to break his stillness, not by speaking immediately, but by slowly standing as if acknowledging that his function within the process had reached its endpoint. He looked once at the screen, then closed his access panel entirely, allowing the interface to fade into a neutral system state. Around the table, other executives followed similar patterns of disengagement, not in protest, but in recognition that further input no longer influenced any variable in the system. Richard Hale remained seated longer than the others, his eyes fixed on the central display, which now showed a final governance confirmation seal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a subdued tone, stripped of earlier resistance or authority. "So everything has been decided," he said quietly, not as a question, but as acknowledgement. Evelyn Carter stood at the front of the room, her posture unchanged, her attention steady across the remaining participants. Her voice, when it came, remained calm and structured, carrying the same controlled precision that had defined every phase of the process. "Everything has been confirmed," she replied. "The system does not operate on decisions at this stage. It operates on validation." The distinction was final in nature, leaving no interpretive space. Daniel, now fully disengaged from active input, looked toward Richard briefly before speaking one last time in a professional tone. "All executive access pathways have been transitioned to read-only status," he said. No one responded, because no correction was necessary. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving from the screen to the room itself, as if reassessing not the event, but the structure he had operated within for years. Evelyn took a step forward, not toward any individual, but into the center of the space that now functioned as a completed record rather than an active meeting. "What occurred here," she said, "was not removal of leadership, but confirmation of governance alignment across all operational layers." The central display dimmed slightly, leaving only the final status indicator visible, confirming that the governance review cycle had concluded without deviation. A few executives began gathering their belongings quietly, not in dismissal, but in procedural acceptance that their participation in this session had reached its defined endpoint. Richard remained seated for a final moment, then slowly placed both hands on the table, acknowledging without words that the structure had shifted beyond influence or reversal. Evelyn delivered her final statement with the same calm authority that had carried throughout the entire process. "From this point forward," she said, "authority will not be interpreted through position. It will be executed through verified system governance." The screen behind her held its final confirmation